The school district was segregated.
It was unfair in every way.
Maybe we needed to bus the children.
We were deemed one of the worst schools in America.
A set of not great choices doesn't do much for anyone.
So when I consider school choice, I call it chance.
My kid had to go to DSST.
Just getting out of 8th grade is enough.
The overarching goal is to have great schools in every neighborhood.
Thanks for standing in the gap in this community.
Major funding for Standing in the Gap provided by the Gates Family Foundation, a Colorado foundation promoting excellence and innovation in Colorado schools since 1946. Daniel and Janet Mordecai Foundation, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, the Piton Foundation, and Rose Community Foundation. With support from these fine organizations and viewers like you, thank you.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
It started in the early 1970s, and Denver was found to have deliberately segregated African American students.
There had not been any black school board members. Rachel was the first.
If we considered all people equal, then there would be excellence at every school.
There's no easy answer to how you close or fix the achievement gap, or it would have been done by now.
The Centennial State is home to one of the largest and fastest growing school districts in the country, Denver Public Schools. It is also the most segregated district in Colorado, with educational achievement gaps between affluent white students and those of color, a phenomenon facing school districts across the United States. Montbello and Green Valley Ranch have a history of failing schools. Yet, an active and vocal community is addressing racial inequities to change the status quo in far northeast Denver.
The core part of my childhood was spent in Montbello, and Green Valley Ranch was just got started. Being able to now live in a community that's flourished and that really has made a name for itself is a badge of honor. For me, as a single mom, going to college is definitely, it's a no-brainer for my kids. They will go to college. At the same time, we have to talk about how do we pay for it. I graduated with a 4.3 GPA. I was fourth in my class. As an adult, I realized that an A in my classroom at Montbello High School did not mean the same thing as an A in a more privileged community. I studied at the University of Denver, Daniels College of Business. I wasn't prepared for that type of academic push, academic focus, so there was a lot of remediation. There's still, to this day, a lot of remediation that students have to go through because they're simply not ready.
My mom grew up straight A's, and she thinks education is really important. That's why she pushes me so hard.
She's also motivational when it comes to our activity that we do is basketball. She also reflects on what basketball and education will have for our future.
When I see a Trayvon Martin trial, or when I see an Eric Gardner being choked, that's my child. As a parent, you sit and you literally tell yourself at any given time, that can be my kid. So with race now being thrown back in our face and us being able to talk about it and where we were, where we've come, and where we need to go, I do think that education is a huge component of that.
Denver's history of race and education is complex. An ever-evolving political and demographic landscape creates challenges for educators and families alike. Yet, despite its mission that every child succeeds, students of different ethnic and socioeconomic status in Denver Public Schools largely achieve at different levels, unacceptably low levels for the majority of Latino, Black, and low-income students. This is not a new trend. Like cities across the country, Denver segregated students by race until civil rights activists of the 1960s decided that they've had enough.
There are people who think that Denver was this little community where there was no worry about, segregation and so forth, but I grew up in the time where if I wanted to go to the movie, I had to sit upstairs. The swimming pools in the city were such that the white kids went on Monday and the Latino kids went on Tuesday, and the Asian kids went on Thursday, and the black kids went on Friday. Then the pool was drained so that it would be clean for the white kids to swim again on Monday.
The school district was segregated, and it was segregated not simply by neighborhood housing patterns, but by deliberate action by the Board of Education and the administration in establishing boundaries for schools.
The Voorhees Committee report especially made it very clear that we did not even meet the separate and equal ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, which the Supreme Court passed in 1896. So we weren't even giving separate but equal education. Many of the minority schools had no gymnasiums, no cafeterias, no libraries, or if they had libraries, they had 3 books per student instead of 13 books per student. It was unfair in every way.
And in 1963, Rachel Noel, a black woman, was elected to the board. And at that point, she and I together began to move within the board toward trying to get the school board and the administration to adopt a desegregation plan.
We had to develop something that would say, how do we make this happen? So what came from that was then to say, maybe we needed to bus the children. There had not been any black school board members. Rachel was the first. And so then it was really meaningful that we had somebody who we felt could really speak for the community and was courageous enough to be able to do that.
The Noel Resolution was presented to the Board of Education on April 25, 1968, calling for the DPS superintendent to develop a plan for integration, providing equal educational opportunity for all children. Public opposition was high, and Noel and her family received many threatening letters and phone calls.
We were defeated by Jim Perrell and Frank Southworth.
Once the newly elected school board overturned the superintendent's plan to integrate, Park Hill residents and activists joined together under Wilfred Keyes and sued the school district. They alleged that officials acted intentionally to create a racially segregated system.
And he was a very outgoing man. He was very strong-willed, and what he believed, he believed.
My husband, enjoyed people, loved to talk. He just loved people.
He just wanted things to be better for kids in that day, which was back in the 60s.
Right during the trial, someone set bombs or dynamite between buses on the parking lot, the school parking lot. One of the bombs was at the Keyes home.
I was at the dining room table, and I was doing homework and heard something at the door. And so my dad goes to the door, and right away he says, "Oh, it's a bomb on the porch."
After all the noise, we came back in the house, and I was crying.
We all came into the living room. All the windows were all out, big old hole in the porch. And so that's when this man comes up through this hole with all this dust, and he says, "Oh, is everybody okay? Is everybody okay?"
The person that bombed us came in the house. I didn't realize it then.
After he asked us if everybody was all right, he left. Well, the next morning, the detectives come out. And so they're asking questions, and, they're looking all around. They ask, did anything strange or whatever happen? So then I mentioned about this white man coming in, and I told him no white man lived across the street. So when I started talking and the detectives started questioning me, they showed me some mug shots, and I identified him.
To hear how they handled it, the next day was just so wonderful. You can't scare us. You can't make us not do this. This is too important, not just for our kids, but for all kids and for our country.
The landmark Keyes versus School District No. 1, Denver, otherwise known as the Keyes case, was the biggest desegregation case outside the South and went all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1973 ruled in favor of Keyes and mandated that all of Denver's school districts must be desegregated via busing.
When the busing started, the safety of the children was, people were terrified. They wanted to do it because they knew it was the right thing to do. And the people on the other side were just as terrified. We're got to go on that side of town, and they hate us. So the poor kids. And then when you hear about buses being burned and bombed because people didn't want that to happen.
My mother lived through busing and DPS, and there's many stories she's told me as she was growing up and how she was treated poorly because she was a black student. Busing didn't make people all of a sudden see my mom as an equal, didn't see this young black girl as just as equal as her white counterpart or her rich counterpart. That didn't change.
Her name was Mrs. Hardy, and we used to do school plays, and she was very selective who would be in the school play. She would make these beautiful gowns, and we were dancing, and we did all this, and so afterwards, we had turned in our costumes, and I remember her calling me out, and I thought she was going to tell me I did a great job, you were wonderful in the play, and she put the costume in my face, and she started saying, "You people are so dirty, look what you did." You know how you get ring around the collar? I had to suck up my face and go back in class and pretend like she told me. And I remember telling a lie, telling my friends, "Oh, she just told me I did a great job," and holding in the humiliation that she had put me through in the hallway.
I didn't really notice a difference until days like picture day, when they would give out the combs, and that comb never worked for my hair. And then once when I was in third grade, we were learning about flathead Indians, and when they were babies, their parents would carry them on a piece of wood, so the back of their heads became flat, so they called them flathead Indians. Well, in third grade, I thought that was hilarious, and so I started laughing, and the teacher said, "I don't know why you think that's so funny. Black people have kinky hair and big noses." And that was the first time that I ever noticed that I was different from everybody else in the class, and I felt really kind of embarrassed to be who I was.
Once those children were able to go to the white schools and the white children were going to the black schools, public pressure and district policy went about equalizing all of the schools. And so that movement towards true equality of educational opportunity across the entire district really began with the court order.
22 years after federally mandated busing began, the courts revisited the Keys case. In 1995, the court determined that the vestiges of past discrimination by the defendants have been eliminated to the extent practicable, and thus ended mandated desegregation in Denver public schools. Almost immediately, the resegregation began. The school board, acting under tremendous pressure from a wide range of constituency groups wanting neighborhood schools, drew boundaries that once again fostered segregation.
They could have decided that they were going to do what they could to promote integration to the greatest extent possible while allowing families choice that the state law requires. They decided instead to kind of go to one more or less extreme, really, which was completely back to neighborhood schools, which in a segregated city means segregated schools.
We were really following the political will of the community. There was no longer any appetite for busing, including among the African American and Latino leaders and parents in the city. No one wanted it.
Once busing was over, then what do you do? And if you switch to neighborhood schools, but you still believe in equality of opportunity, how do you reconcile those two things? And if people want to go to a neighborhood school, fine, but what if it's not very strong and they want their kids to go somewhere else? To what extent is the school district responsible for transportation, or the city? So lots of conversations about how we tried to equalize educational opportunity given that busing was gone and neighborhood schools were back.
Montbello originally developed as a suburban community in 1965 after the city annexed land in far northeast Denver. Montbello High School opened in 1980. Today, the community is largely Hispanic and African American, with only 4% Caucasians. However, Green Valley Ranch, a newer community developed on the same annexed land, is currently one of Denver's most affordable and fastest growing communities. It is also one of the city's most integrated, with Latinos comprising 43%, African Americans 28%, and whites 19%.
I moved to Montbello back in 1979, early 1980. And at that time, that community was what I would call a very, very proud but young community.
Llegamos a Montbello sin conocer a nadie. Cuando mis hijos entraron a la escuela fue la oportunidad para conocer a gente nueva y saber que tienes vecinos con las mismas costumbres que tú. Es como sentirte un poquito más en confianza y más cerca de tu país.
We definitely had the stigma of community of color. There must be gang problems, drug problems, and it's just this, area in which you just can't, it's just so toxic.
One of the first entrees into education was we bought some land at an auction that was from the FDIC down in Dallas. I got home, opened up a bottle of wine. Diane Sawyer was doing a documentary on the 5 worst schools in America, and one of them happened to be in one of our master plan communities.
We were deemed one of the worst schools in America. That is literally the brand that my middle school received. And that school, that was the only middle school in this community at the time. And if you went, if you lived in Montbello, you fit right into Montbello High School.
Montbello was a disaster of a school back then. It was known for gang violence. There was a kid stabbed to death in the cafeteria. I remember that. It was just a place where nobody who didn't have to send their kid there or felt like they had no other choice would send their kid.
I was very disappointed when our son was preparing for high school that there was not a school that either on the performance report card was performing at a level that I felt like he needed, that would be a school for him and give him the opportunity to really prepare himself. And that was disappointing. And that was one of the reasons that sparked, quite frankly, my involvement in turning schools around.
It had deteriorated so bad in the community in terms of educational opportunity that I felt that some responsibility for not being as actively involved in what was going on in the community at that point.
We met probably, I would say, for about 3 months, evaluating, looking at data, looking at the situation as a whole. And then we came out of that meeting saying, something's got to happen. Here's what we want to do as a group. We think that we need to close Montbello, start over, and we need to change the way education looked, not just at Montbello, but throughout the whole community.
There were, I feel like, a good group of community members that we just didn't want to look at the high school only. We also wanted to look at those feeder schools.
So Stacy and I worked together with many of the neighborhood and community leaders to put before the community over a year's period of time to draw up the kind of schools that they would want to have in the community. Closing Montbello and reopening Montbello High School was the first step toward a better moment, toward a better opportunity.
Are we done? No, we're not done. We just got started. I mean, we had to clean up a whole lot of things. We had to filter through a lot of stuff just to get to where we are right now.
In 2011, Denver Public Schools opened several new charter schools as part of its turnaround strategy for the entire region. Although charter schools are part of the school district, they have more autonomy over factors such as curriculum and the length of the school year.
So our strategic plan, our Denver plan, is very clear. The overarching goal is to have great schools in every neighborhood. And we say to our families, first, look at the schools in your neighborhood. We've got good schools. But we also want to have the opportunity for choice for families if they want a choice out of their neighborhood in order to go to a different school. But clearly the most important element, a set of not great choices doesn't do much for anyone.
We have some very high performing schools, but then we have some very low performing schools, and we have a ton in the middle. So if I were to put it in one word, I would say mediocre, which is unacceptable. And I do know that those high performing schools, It's hard to get your kid in that school. It's hard. It's the hardest thing. My kid had to go to DSST. There was nowhere else that I could see her being successful because there were so many holes in her education at the school that she was at.
I'm in the IB program at George Washington. It had the best IB program in the district, and because I would be able to play 5A varsity basketball for Colorado. DSST high school didn't offer that.
So when I consider school choice, I call it chance, because it's still a system where in so many places you have a limit of how many students can get in. And so it's really a roll of the dice, and you give people false hope by saying it's choice. It undermines the quality of the neighborhood school too.
The Denver Schools of Science and Technology, or DSST, is a network of charter schools and DPS that operates in multiple locations across Denver and, within 10 years, will serve 25% of secondary students in the district. The DSST campus at Green Valley Ranch, part of a network of charter schools that has boasted 5 of the 6 top-performing schools in DPS, exhibits the highest test scores in the far Northeast. Notably, every member of its first graduating class, the class of 2015, was granted acceptance at a 4-year institution, and in doing so, continues the streak set by the DSST Stapleton campus in 2008. Although the Black and Latino scores at DSST are much higher than the district-wide scores, the gap still exists between white students and those of color at the DSST Green Valley Ranch campuses, varying from 14 to 30 percentage points in math and reading.
One of the core design principles of the school was to create an integrated school. Denver was one of the few cities in the country that really has a diverse population that lives in the city core. And so we just acknowledged that as a real opportunity and strength to build on. And so we created a lottery process that said, let's make sure we have a school that reflects the rich diversity of the city. When integration is not a core value, and when there is not opportunities for people to select in a self-interested way, integrated schools would typically fall apart.
The racial makeup of Denver public schools has shifted over the decades. In 1970, before the inception of busing, almost 100,000 students walked the halls of Denver public schools' 117 campuses. White students formed nearly 2/3 of the population. Latinos less than a quarter, and black students at just 14%. By the time busing ended in 1995, enrollment had dropped to about 64,000 students, and the racial makeup had shifted dramatically. Where white students once comprised the majority, now Latinos did. They formed nearly half of the school district's population, while white and black students each hovered around a quarter of total district enrollment. This is largely due to the fact that during busing, white families fled to the suburbs or enrolled their students in private and parochial schools. Today, DPS has nearly regained its enrollment from 1970. It is one of the fastest growing urban school districts in the country. The number of schools has ballooned to 185. However, its racial makeup still does not mirror that of the city it serves, the city of Denver. The current demographic breakdown of DPS is not evenly spread amongst racial groups. Latino students comprise 57% of the district population, black students 14%, and white students 22%. Few schools in DPS, however, mirror this racial breakdown.
The achievement gap is the difference in basically academic success between more affluent kids who tend generally to be white and lower income kids who tend to be kids of color, that there is a really yawning gap that often grows as they progress farther into school.
There has really been no change in the gaps since the mid-1980s at the height of busing. Low income and minority children are still only scoring at about 40% of what white students are scoring.
And I think the achievement gap comes from a very real perspective that there are some individuals who just getting out of 8th grade is enough, who just getting through high school is enough. And then there's another demographic of individuals who are being told graduate school, higher education. And I think the achievement gap that I see comes in the messaging that we give to students.
The achievement gap is as well the time and opportunity that our parents have to really be advocates for their own child's education.
Bueno, yo pienso que no es tanto la escuela, tiene que ver mucho los padres involucrarse. Nosotros venimos, los ayudamos a nuestros hijos, a sus tareas y estamos ahí enfocados con ellos. Entonces, tiene que ver mucho uno como padre, el nivel del niño.
These gaps are the result of decades, if not centuries, of inequities in this country based on race and based on income, and they will take time to close. And there is not one single silver bullet fix.
So figuring out how we have teacher preparation, teacher training, we have students who are used to being around kids who learn differently. I mean, I think for society, diversity is an absolute essential.
The inequities that already exist and how important race becomes within our society, you've got to make sure that people know how to have those hard conversations.
You know, we talk about starting a conversation. My grandfather would tell you, we've been talking about this too long. Folks are saying, yeah, that's all it's been for the last 50 years is talk. We're tired of marches on Washington. We're tired of marches down, the Civic Center. We're tired of all of these marches. Folks want deliberate action that aligns with what has already been promised. I think that is where we start.
If we can get all of us at least in the same room or on the same program or at least dialoguing, we can bring multiple individuals from multiple communities together to at least figure out where are we at and where are we going.
Although achievement gaps have remained consistent since integration began, efforts to close the gap are slowly changing the trend. Yet 20 years after the end of busing, segregation is still a reality, and more high-performing schools are needed for every child, regardless of their race, to have access to a great education.